completely still. When I was 11, my foster mom Janet handed me a Mickey Mouse t-shirt and said, "We're going to Disneyland tomorrow. Act like you love me." You see, the social worker was coming for our annual review. Janet had 3 foster kids, but I was the oldest, which meant I was the problem. The other 2 were cute and little. I'd been through 4 homes already and had this thing where I didn't talk much. My foster mom explained that the social worker, Ms. Williams, would meet us at the park for a casual observation, and we needed to look like a real family. "Hold my hand on the rides," she instructed. "Call me Mom." She'd been collecting $800 a month for me for 2 years, but we'd never gone anywhere fun. Hell, she barely looked at me most days, but now she needed me to perform. Janet kept reminding me, "Remember what happens if they move you again? You want to start 7th grade at another new school?" The day started weird. Janet woke me up at 6 a.m. with an actual breakfast. Not the usual moldy bread I ate alone at 5:30 a.m. She made pancakes with syrup. I was allowed to eat at the table instead of the floor. She even bought me new clothes that fit, not the Goodwill BS that was always 2 sizes too big or too small. In the car, she let me sit in the front seat instead of the back with the babies. "So tell me about your friends," she said, gripping the steering wheel. I didn't have any friends, but I made some up to make her happy. At Disneyland, Janet transformed into this whole different person. She bought me a pair of ears with my name stitched on them, my actual name, not girl or hey you, like usual. When Ms. Williams appeared near the entrance, Janet grabbed my hand and squeezed it 3 times. Our signal. "Ready for the best day ever, sweetie?" she said loud enough for everyone to hear. Her hand was soft. I forgot adults' hands could be soft. The thing is, it actually was amazing. We went on Space Mountain first, and Janet screamed and laughed, grabbing my arm on the drops. Not the usual grab. This was gentle, playful. For a second, I forgot why we were there. She won me a massive Stitch plushie at the basketball game, cheering when I made a shot. "That's my girl," she yelled. 2 years living there, and she'd never claimed me as hers before. She didn't even yell when I dropped ketchup on my new shirt. She just wiped it off and said, "No big deal, baby." Ms. Williams kept appearing randomly. Outside Pirates, in line for Thunder Mountain. Each time Janet would pull me closer, point at something, laugh at nothing. But between the check-ins, something weird happened. Janet started being nice when no one was around. On the Matterhorn, she held my hand. Her thumb rubbed my knuckles during the scary parts. At home, she wouldn't even pass me the salt without sighing like I'd ruined her life. But here, she bought me light-up Mickey ice cream just because I stared at it. Didn't call me a fat fuck, just smiled and said, "You want rainbow or blue?" When I pointed at the dancers, she didn't tell me pinch me until I bled. When fireworks started, she pulled me against her side and I could feel her crying a little. "This is nice," she whispered. "Really nice." Her voice sounded different, softer, like how she talked to the little kids when they had nightmares. I'd heard it through the walls, that gentle voice that never came to my room when I woke up screaming. I started thinking maybe this was it. Maybe she finally saw me as more than a monthly check. Maybe she'd stop locking the good food in her bedroom closet. I held her hand without being told, called her mom without the signal. "You're a good kid," she said into my hair. "You know that?" Nobody had told me that since my real mom died. Then Ms. Williams appeared one last time, right by the castle. She had this clipboard and a tight smile. "Just wanted to say goodbye. You two look wonderful together." Janet's whole body changed. She straightened up, adjusted her smile, became the performance version again. "We're just so lucky," she said in that fake voice. "Aren't we, honey?" I didn't say a word. The car ride home was silent. Janet turned the radio off and stared straight ahead. We pulled into the driveway and Janet turned off the engine. She sat there for a full minute before speaking. "Miss Art Williams approved us for another year," she said to the steering wheel, "so that's good." She opened her door and got out. "Leave the ears in the car. They're returnable." The next morning, my Disneyland shirt was in the trash. She said it was dirty. When I asked if we could look at the pictures she took, she said her phone was dead. That night, I heard her on the phone laughing about the whole thing. "You should have seen me," she said. "Mother of the fucking year." Williams ate it up. That's when I knew I had to escape. The next night, I lay on my sleeping bag on Janet's laundry room floor, counting the drips from the water heater. Every 17 seconds, another drop hit the drain. The concrete pressed through the thin fabric into my spine. My Disneyland clothes were already in the trash, but I'd grabbed the receipt when Janet wasn't looking and tucked it inside my pillowcase. Proof we actually went. At 5:30 a.m., my alarm went off and I shuffled to the kitchen for my usual breakfast. The moldy bread sat on the counter where Janet always left it. The little kids got Cheerios with milk at the table. I got to stand at the counter eating around the green spots while Janet's real food stayed locked in her bedroom closet. She walked in while I was chewing and looked me up and down. Said if I got fat, she'd make me sleep outside. The school bus came at 7:15 and I sat in my usual spot in the back. That afternoon, the phone rang during my chores and Janet's voice went sweet like honey. Ms. Williams wanted to schedule a follow-up home visit in 2 weeks. Janet kept saying how wonderful that would be while staring straight at me with those cold eyes that promised pain later. That night, I found an old notebook in the recycling and hid it in my pillowcase with the receipt. Started making tallies on the pages. 3 days without real food, 4 bruises on my arms, 6 times she called me worthless just that week. 2 days later, I made the mistake of staring too long at Janet's locked closet. She grabbed my wrist and twisted hard enough that I heard something pop. Asked if I thought I was smart. Asked if I thought anyone would believe trash like me over her. She'd been doing this for 8 years and knew exactly what to say. She twisted harder until my knees hit the floor. 3 days after that, I wore long sleeves to school even though it was 95 degrees outside. My teacher asked if I was feeling okay and I said yes because that's what you say. Teachers ask, but they don't really want to know. At lunch, I watched a girl throw away a whole sandwich because it had mayo on it. Another kid complained that his mom packed carrots instead of chips. I hadn't eaten anything but that moldy bread for 2 days and my stomach felt like it was eating itself. Then Ms. Williams showed up for a surprise visit while Janet was at work. I was watching the little kids, which was illegal since I was only 13, but Janet had trained us good. Told Ms. Williams that Janet was just in the shower. Ms. Williams waited 20 minutes in the living room asking me questions about school while I kept making up lies about how long showers take. She finally left a note on the kitchen table. When Janet saw that note, she didn't hit me directly because she was too smart for that. Instead, she accidentally knocked me down the stairs when I was carrying laundry. 14 steps and I hit every single one. She cried about how clumsy I was when I couldn't stand up right away. Kept saying we needed to get my balance checked by a doctor. The next day, she made me sleep in the garage for being careless about Ms. Williams visiting. Lily watched from her bedroom doorway while Janet dragged my sleeping bag out there. Lily was Janet's real daughter and hadn't said a single word to me in 2 years. But that night when I went to get water from the washing machine tap, I found a granola bar sitting on top of it. The wrapper still had the price tag on it from the gas station down the street. 3 days later at school, I spent lunch in the library staring at the big map of Riverside's bus routes pinned to the wall. The librarian smiled when she saw me taking notes and asked if I needed help with my geography project. I just nodded and kept writing down which buses went to the police station on Magnolia Avenue and which ones stopped at the hospital. Hollis found me there after the bell rang and waited until we were alone by the lockers. He looked around first to make sure no one was listening, then pulled up his sleeve to show old burn marks on his arm. He told me Janet did the same Disneyland thing with him last year when Ms. Williams came for his review. The next week, I stood in the girls' bathroom at school trying to practice what I would tell someone, but my mouth wouldn't work right. Every time I opened it to say the words about Janet, nothing came out except this weird choking sound. Janet started getting the house ready for Ms. Williams's next visit by bringing home bags of new clothes from Target. She pulled fresh apples and oranges out of her locked bedroom closet and put them in the kitchen bowl. She made us all try on the new clothes and told us to smile more and reminded us that happy families stay together while squeezing my shoulder hard. The morning Mrs. Williams was supposed to come, Janet left to get her hair done at the salon on University Avenue. I was sitting at the kitchen table doing Lily's math homework while she watched cartoons when we heard the doorbell ring. Mrs. Williams stood there with her clipboard looking confused about why Janet wasn't home. I told her Janet would be back soon and offered her some water, while Lily just stared from the couch. Mrs. Williams walked around the living room looking at everything and wrote something down when she saw the locks on the bedroom closet door. I wonder what Janet's real plan is here with all this Disneyland show. She's been collecting that money for 2 years but suddenly needs to look perfect. There's something about the way she switches between nice and mean that makes me think she knows exactly what she's doing, like she's done this dance before with other kids. When Janet rushed in 20 minutes later with her hair all perfect, she laughed and made up some story about sisterly bonding time. But I saw Ms. Williams watching how I moved away when Janet tried to touch my head. After Ms. Williams left, Lily followed me to the bathroom and closed the door behind us. She whispered that her mom had 3 other foster kids before me who all got removed, but Janet always got them back somehow. She said the kids never came back though, and she didn't know where they went. 2 nights later, I was looking for another blanket in the garage because mine had holes in it. Behind some old boxes, I found a plastic bin full of newspaper clippings from the Press Enterprise. The headline said things about Janet being cleared of abuse charges and investigations finding no evidence. 3 different kids over 5 years, and all the articles said the same thing about lack of proof. Hollis came into the garage while I was reading them and pulled up his shirt to show me the scars all over his back. He said Janet was smart about where she hit and when she did it so no one would hear. He said she had friends at CPS who helped her, and that's why nothing ever stuck. That night I couldn't sleep, so I did the math in my head over and over. 2 years times $800 a month meant Janet got $19,200 just for me. I owned 3 shirts and 2 pairs of pants from Goodwill and ate moldy bread most mornings. The numbers made my stomach hurt worse than being hungry did. 3 days later, Mrs. Rodriguez called me to her office during second period math class. I walked as slow as possible down the empty hallway and sat in the hard plastic chair across from her desk while she typed something on her computer. She looked up and pushed her glasses up her nose and said I'd been marked late 17 times this month, even though I lived closer to school than almost anyone. I wasn't actually late, but I sat on the curb outside until the very last second before the bell rang, because going inside meant 8 hours of pretending everything was fine before going back to Janet's house. Mrs. Rodriguez leaned forward and her voice got softer when she asked if everything was okay at home, and for once it sounded like she actually wanted to know instead of just checking a box on some form. I opened my mouth but then remembered what happened to the last kid who told and just shrugged and said I was bad at waking up early. 2 weeks passed before Mrs. Williams showed up again, but this time she brought her supervisor and they came on a Saturday morning without calling first. Janet must have had some kind of sixth sense because the house was already perfect when they knocked. Fresh chocolate chip cookies were baking in the oven, and Hollis and the little kids sat at the kitchen table doing homework even though it was Saturday, and I wore the new clothes Janet bought the day before that still had the tags hidden inside. Janet smiled and offered them coffee while I sat next to her on the couch, and she put her arm around me, and I smiled so hard my face hurt because my life literally depended on making this look real. They stayed for 2 hours asking questions about school and friends and activities, and Janet had coached us on every answer the night before with threats about what would happen if we messed up. After they finally left, Janet's whole body changed like someone flipped a switch. She stood up and looked at me and said I did good, then grabbed my arm and dragged me to the garage and pushed me inside and locked the door behind me. I spent 2 days in there with no food or water or bathroom, sitting on the cold concrete floor, planning exactly how I would run away and where I would go and how I would survive on my own. Sunday morning, while Janet was at church, Lily slipped crackers and a juice box under the garage door and whispered she was sorry through the crack. She said she couldn't help more because Janet was her mom, but maybe after she graduated next year she could do something, but she never finished the thought, and I heard her footsteps running away. Monday morning, Janet finally let me out 5 minutes before we had to leave for school, and I could barely walk from sitting on concrete for 2 days. At school, the nurse called me in for the mandatory scoliosis check, and when I lifted my shirt, she saw the bruises all over my ribs from where Janet had grabbed me. She asked how it happened, and I said I fell off my bike even though I didn't have a bike, and she wrote it down on her clipboard, but her eyes stayed on my skinny arms and the way my ribs showed through my skin. That afternoon, Janet started her new plan by telling all the neighbors I was disturbed and had serious mental problems. She showed them scratches on her arms that I watched her make herself with her own fingernails in the bathroom mirror that morning and told them I attacked her during one of my episodes. She put on this sad voice and said they were getting me help because it was so hard with traumatized foster children who couldn't bond with normal families. The next day, Hollis pulled me aside at lunch and told me Janet was building a case against me, just like she did with the last foster kid named David. He showed me the hall closet where Janet kept a folder full of fake incident reports she typed up on the computer about things that never happened, like me threatening the little kids, or breaking dishes on purpose, or screaming at night. Mrs. Rodriguez called me back to her office later that week, and this time her face looked different, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. She said my foster mom was concerned about my behavior, and reported that I'd been hurting myself, and showed me an email from Janet with a list of supposed warning signs. I rolled up my sleeves to show her my arms had no cuts or scratches, but Janet had already planted the seed of doubt, and I could see Mrs. Rodriguez didn't know what to believe anymore. Friday afternoon, Ms. Williams showed up at school with official papers and pulled me out of PE class. She had a psychiatric evaluation order that said Janet reported I was showing signs of severe emotional disturbance and needed immediate intervention. The evaluation was scheduled for next Tuesday at a facility called Riverside Behavioral Health, where it turned out Janet's friend from church worked as an intake counselor. That night, I pressed my ear against my bedroom door and heard Janet on the phone with someone talking in her fake concerned voice. She said I was definitely showing signs of reactive attachment disorder and described me as a classic case who wouldn't bond with the family and had aggressive outbursts and told pathological lies about being mistreated. Every word was carefully chosen to make sure nobody would believe anything I might say about what really happened in that house. The next morning, Lily knocked on my door before school, which was weird because she never came to my room. She asked if I could grab her math book from her desk while she was in the bathroom. I went into her room and saw her laptop sitting open on her bed with the screen still on. The browser had Gmail open, and I couldn't help but notice the subject line of one email that said, "Making them look crazy. What works?" My hands started shaking as I clicked on it. The email thread was between Janet and 3 other foster parents from the area, talking about how to document behavioral problems that didn't exist. One woman wrote about how she'd convinced a doctor her foster son had violent tendencies by bruising herself and taking photos. Another talked about keeping a fake incident log with made-up dates and times of aggressive episodes. Janet had replied with tips about using specific medical terms that would trigger automatic diagnoses. She mentioned keeping foster kids isolated so they couldn't make friends who might defend them. The thread went back months with dozens of messages about maximizing state payments and getting rid of difficult placements. I heard the toilet flush and quickly closed the laptop and grabbed the math book. 3 days before my psychiatric evaluation, Janet put on the biggest show yet. I was locked in the garage doing homework when I heard her start screaming for help outside. Through the small window, I could see her in the driveway holding her face and crying. The neighbors came running out of their houses, and Janet was sobbing about how I'd hit her again, and she didn't know what to do anymore. Mrs. Chen from next door was holding Janet's shoulders while Mr. Peterson called 911. Janet had a red mark on her cheek that was already starting to bruise. She kept saying she loved me but couldn't handle the violence anymore. The whole time I was pounding on the garage door, but nobody could hear me over Janet's performance. When the cops showed up 20 minutes later, Janet suddenly remembered I'd run off and she didn't want to press charges because I was just a troubled child who needed help, not jail. After that, everything at school changed fast. Kids who used to sit with me at lunch moved to other tables. Teachers stopped calling on me in class even when I raised my hand. In PE, nobody wanted me on their team. I heard whispers in the hallway about the crazy foster kid who beat up her mom. Even the janitor looked at me different when I walked by. Sarah, who used to be my lab partner, asked to switch seats because her parents told her to stay away from me. The principal started doing random checks where he'd pull me out of class to search my backpack for weapons. Every day felt like drowning in slow motion, with nobody throwing me a life jacket. Hollis found me crying behind the gym during lunch on Thursday. I was sitting on the ground with my knees pulled up trying to disappear. He sat down next to me without saying anything for a minute. Then I told him Janet was going to win and get me sent away. He pulled out his phone and showed me the screen. Hollis. Pulling out his phone at the end there has perfect timing. Nothing says I've got dirt on Janet like a dramatic phone reveal when someone's crying behind the gym. There were 3 video files dated from the last 2 weeks. He said he'd been recording Janet when she didn't know, catching her real voice calling us worthless parasites who were only good for the checks. My heart stopped when I realized we finally had proof. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled me aside after school the next day when I was walking to the bus. She asked me to come to her office for a minute. Once the door was closed, she looked at me with this expression I'd never seen from an adult before, like she actually cared. She said she'd been doing this job for 20 years and knew when something wasn't right. She said she'd seen Janet's type before, the ones who were good at fooling the system. She told me whatever was happening I could tell her the truth, but I was too scared because Janet had already convinced everyone I was a liar. The morning of my psychiatric evaluation, Ms. Williams picked me up in her county car. She said Dr. Brennan was one of the best child psychiatrists in the district and would help figure out what I needed. The office was in this tall building downtown with lots of plants in the waiting room. Dr. Brennan was this older man with glasses who kept writing on his notepad while I talked. Every question he asked was loaded, like when did I start having violent thoughts, or how often did I hurt myself? When I said I didn't have violent thoughts, he wrote something down and asked why I was being defensive. When I said I never hurt myself, he asked if I was lying to avoid treatment. 2 hours into the evaluation, they gave me a break to use the bathroom. On my way back, I heard Dr. Brennan on the phone in his office. He was saying yes to someone, and then I heard him say Janet's name. He said I was showing all the signs she'd mentioned, and the diagnosis was pretty clear. That's when I knew the whole evaluation was just theater, and the conclusion was already written before I even walked in. Lily picked me up afterward, and I could tell something was wrong by how quiet quiet she was. Once we were driving, she told me her mom was planning something big. She said Janet had been talking to lawyers about making me a ward of the state because I was too dangerous for family placement. The car felt like a coffin closing around me. That night, Janet put on another performance when Ms. Williams called to check in. She had me sit next to her on the couch with the phone on speaker. Janet kept saying how much she loved me and wanted what was best while her fingernails dug into my arm hard enough to draw blood. I could feel the sharp pain, but couldn't make a sound or move away. Ms. Williams was asking about the evaluation, and Janet was using her sweet, concerned mother voice saying she just hoped they could find the right treatment plan. Her nails went deeper every time I shifted even a little bit. After the call, Hollis came to my room and showed me more videos on his phone. He had 3 recordings of Janet screaming at us, calling us mistakes and saying we were worthless parasites who ruined her life. In one video, she was throwing dishes while yelling that foster kids were just paychecks with problems. But Hollis said we needed more because Janet always found ways to explain things away or convince people the videos were taken out of context. The next morning, Janet walked into my room holding a paper like she'd won the lottery. The psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Brennan recommended immediate residential treatment for severe behavioral disorders and oppositional defiance. My stomach dropped to my feet as I read the words that basically said I was crazy and dangerous. Janet had coached me to fail every single test and question during that appointment 2 weeks ago. She stood there smiling while I realized I had exactly 72 hours before they'd ship me to some locked facility where nobody would believe anything I said about her. My hands shook as I held the paper and watched her leave my room humming to herself. At school, Mrs. Rodriguez pulled me aside during lunch and closed her office door behind us. She said something was wrong with Dr. Brennan's report because it didn't match anything she'd seen from me in 2 years. She started making phone calls right there in front of me, asking other teachers about my behavior and pulling up my grades and attendance records. Her face got more serious with each call as people told her I was quiet but never caused problems. Ms. Williams showed up for her monthly visit that afternoon and kept staring at things while Janet talked. She looked at my skinny arms when I reached for a glass of water. She noticed the locks on the pantry door and the bedroom closets. She watched how Janet stood right behind me the whole time with her hand on my shoulder squeezing whenever I started to speak. Ms. Williams asked if anyone else had noticed these behaviors Dr. Brennan described, but her voice sounded uncertain. That night, I made a choice that if I was going down anyway, I'd take Janet with me. I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures of everything while Janet was in the shower. The locked food closet with the good cereal and snacks we weren't allowed to touch. The moldy bread on the counter that was our breakfast every day. My sleeping bag rolled up in the corner of the laundry room where I slept when Janet said my breathing annoyed her. The bruises on my legs from when she kicked me for not cleaning fast enough. I was documenting everything when Lily walked in and caught me taking a picture of the punishment chart on Janet's bedroom door. Instead of telling her mom, she pulled out her own phone and showed me her photo gallery. She had 2 years of evidence, including videos of Janet hitting Hollis and pictures of me sleeping in the garage during winter. She had recordings of her mom calling us worthless and photos of the locked refrigerator at night so we couldn't eat. Lily said she'd been too scared to do anything, but if I was brave enough to fight back, she'd help. We sat on my bed comparing evidence when Janet walked in and saw both our phones out with the photos visible on the screens. Her face went from surprised to furious to calculating in about 3 seconds flat. She looked at us and said nobody would believe 2 messed up teenagers over a respected foster parent who'd been approved for 8 years. But I saw something new in her eyes that I'd never seen before, which was fear. She grabbed both our phones, but Lily had already sent everything to her email and deleted the sent folder. Hollis came in later that night and told us he'd been smarter than all of us. He'd been uploading his recordings to a cloud account that his biological mom could access from prison. She'd lost custody for drugs, but had been clean for a year and was documenting everything from her side to build a case. She knew exactly what Janet was because she'd talked to 2 other kids who'd lived here before us. The next morning, Mrs. Rodriguez called an emergency meeting and basically demanded Ms. Williams come to the school immediately. She'd found 3 previous complaints about Janet that had somehow been closed without investigation. She'd discovered that 2 former foster kids from Janet's house had ended up in psychiatric facilities after similar evaluations from the same Dr. Brennan. She'd tracked down a pattern that everyone had either missed or deliberately ignored for years. The meeting happened in the principal's conference room with Mrs. Rodriguez laying out folder after folder of evidence. Janet showed up playing the overwhelmed single foster mom perfectly, sighing about how hard it was to help troubled children. But Ms. Williams was actually taking notes this time and really looking at the dates and patterns Mrs. Rodriguez had found. She asked why these previous complaints hadn't been investigated, and Janet's face twitched just a little. That night, Janet was weirdly calm at dinner, which scared me more than her screaming ever did. She looked right at me and said I'd made my choice and now I'd have to live with it. She reminded me that she'd survived 3 investigations already, and I wouldn't survive one. After dinner, she grabbed my arm and dragged me to the garage, shoving me inside and locking the door from the outside. No food, no water, no bathroom, just me and the concrete floor, and the knowledge that transport to the facility was coming in 12 hours. I spent the whole night on that cold concrete floor, counting the hours by the sounds outside. My legs went numb around midnight. My stomach stopped hurting around 3. At 5:30, I heard footsteps above me, and then nothing for another 20 minutes. The garage door clicked open at 6, and Lily stood there with car keys in her hand. She pulled me up and shoved the keys at me and told me Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting at school with Ms. Williams. Her hands were shaking worse than mine. She said, "Go now before Mom wakes up." I'd never driven alone before, but I made it to school in 10 minutes. The parking lot was empty except for 2 cars. I ran through the front doors and down the hall to Mrs. Rodriguez's office. She was there with Mr. Williams and another woman I'd never seen before. I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers and showed them everything. Hollis's recordings from under Janet's bed, Lily's photos of the bruises, the video from 2 nights ago when Janet said I was worth $800 a month and nothing more. The new woman took my phone and watched the whole whole video without blinking. Her face got harder with each word Janet said. She watched it twice, then made a call. 20 minutes later, Janet's car screeched into the parking lot. She brought the transport team with her, two big guys in medical uniforms. She walked in playing the perfect worried mother, telling them I was very sick and needed help. Mrs. Williams stood up and said the transport was suspended pending investigation. Janet's face changed for just a second, and I saw pure rage before she fixed her smile. Hollis's biological mom tracking everything from prison makes me really curious about their whole setup. How many kids have actually gone through Janet's house over 8 years? The way Mrs. She started arguing, but then Hollis's bio mom walked in with a man in a suit carrying a thick folder. The lawyer spread papers across the desk, 18 months of recordings typed out, emails printed, photos dated and organized. He said they had proof Janet had been abusing kids for profit. Ms. Williams made another call, and within an hour they ordered an emergency removal. Not of me, but of all 3 foster kids from Janet's house. Mrs. Rodriguez held my hand while they did the paperwork. The little ones got picked up from Janet's that afternoon. That evening I had my own bed in an emergency placement house. Clean sheets that smelled like fabric softener. The foster mom asked what I wanted for dinner, and I couldn't answer for 20 minutes. I just sat there crying because I got to choose. She made me grilled cheese and tomato soup and let me eat as much as I wanted. The next morning, Detective Walsh came to interview me. She'd already seen all the evidence and pulled up Janet's file on her laptop. 3 previous investigations, all closed by the same person. She showed me the pattern, how Janet's friend in child services had been protecting her for years. She said they were opening a criminal case. That afternoon, Lily texted me from her friend's house where she was staying. She said her mom was losing it, calling everyone, trying to control the story. Channel 7 had already called about an interview. The story was spreading everywhere online. 2 days later, I found out Dr. Brennan got arrested. The detective told me they found proof he'd been taking money from foster parents to write fake evaluations. He'd been declaring kids mentally unstable whenever parents got reported for abuse. Janet was one of his best customers, paying him $500 every time she needed a report. A week later, the news story hit Channel 7's evening broadcast, and my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with texts from kids at school. The reporter stood outside Janet's house talking about how 3 of her previous foster kids had come forward after seeing the initial coverage. One guy was living under a bridge downtown after aging out at 18 with no life skills and PTSD from Janet's abuse. Another girl had made it through college but still had nightmares 20 years later. The third one killed himself at 16, 2 months after leaving Janet's house, and his sister was on camera holding his picture and crying about how the system failed him. Hollis and I watched from our new placement, this emergency group home that smelled like bleach and had bars on the windows, but at least nobody hit us. Janet was all over Facebook claiming she was being persecuted for loving difficult children and asking for prayers from her church friends. People were actually defending her in the comments, saying she was a saint for taking in troubled kids and that we were probably lying for attention. The emergency custody hearing happened 3 days later, and Mrs. Rodriguez showed up with a binder 2 inches thick. She testified for 40 minutes straight, pulling out emails she'd sent to CPS, photos she'd taken of my bruises when I came to school, records of every time she'd called about concerns. She told the judge the system protected the abuser instead of the children, and demanded a full investigation into how so many red flags got ignored. The judge ordered an immediate review of every case Mrs. Williams had supervised in the past 5 years. Ms. Williams got placed on administrative leave that same day and found me outside the courthouse afterward. She was crying so hard her mascara ran down her cheeks when she grabbed my shoulders and said she was sorry, that she should have looked harder and believed me instead of Janet's perfect mom act. The detective called me 2 days later with more news about Janet's fraud scheme. She'd been collecting $800 a month for kids who weren't even living with her, farming them out to friends when she went on vacation but keeping all the money. One kid spent 3 months living in her friend's garage while Janet collected checks and told the state he was doing great in her care. 2 weeks after that, Lily testified in a closed hearing with just the judge and lawyers present. She brought journals she'd kept since she was 12, page after page documenting what she'd witnessed Janet do to us foster kids. She told them she was a coward for not speaking up sooner, but she wouldn't be silent anymore, not when other kids were still suffering. My new foster mom started teaching me how to cook real food that week, showing me how to make spaghetti and grilled cheese and scrambled eggs. She kept saying I was too thin and needed to eat more, but she said it gentle, not mean, and she never locked the pantry or made me ask permission to eat. I still checked the locks at night out of habit, but they were never locked. Janet got arrested on a Thursday morning, and the photo of her in handcuffs made the front page of the newspaper. She was screaming at the cameras that we were all lying, that she was the real victim of ungrateful children trying to destroy a good Christian woman. Her lawyer had to physically drag her into the police car, while she kept yelling about conspiracies and persecution. Hollis's bio mom got her life together and got custody back the next week. When he came to pack his stuff, he hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe and told me I did this. I saved everyone. But I knew we'd saved each other, and Lily had saved us both by finally speaking up. The preliminary hearing at the courthouse revealed 7 more kids had come forward from the past 8 years. The prosecutor laid out how Janet had made over $200,000 from the foster system while systematically abusing children for profit, calling it exploitation of the most vulnerable members of society. A month passed with more legal stuff happening every day, and that's when 3 more kids who'd lived with Janet years before reached out to the prosecutor. They'd seen the news coverage and recognized the pattern, the same Disney trips right before evaluations, the same sudden psychiatric diagnoses when they complained, the same stories about troubled kids nobody would believe. One girl named Sarah had recordings too, hidden on an old phone she'd kept for 5 years, waiting for someone to finally listen. The prosecutor's office set up a conference room where we all met and shared our experiences, comparing notes about Janet's methods, realizing she'd been doing this for over a decade. Detective Walsh started digging deeper into the foster care records and found something bigger than just Janet, a whole whole network of foster parents using the same playbook, sharing tips on private Facebook groups about how to discredit kids who complained. She showed me screenshots of their conversations, foster parents trading advice about which psychiatrists would diagnose kids without asking questions, which social workers would look the other way, how to document fake behavioral problems. The FBI got involved when they discovered the network crossed state lines, with foster parents in Nevada and Arizona using Janet's exact methods. Meanwhile, Lily had moved out of Janet's house to live with her dad, who'd been fighting for custody for 10 years, but Janet had convinced the courts he was dangerous. He showed me the court documents where Janet had testified against him, claiming he'd threatened her and the kids, all lies that kept him away from his daughter. The local news picked up the story, and that's when reporters discovered Janet had been collecting adoption subsidies for kids she never actually adopted, filing paperwork saying the adoptions were complete while keeping the kids as foster placements. The fraud went back 8 years with fake signatures and forged documents, adding federal charges to the growing list. At the next court hearing, Janet's lawyer tried to turn everything around, calling us troubled kids making up stories for attention and money. He had a psychiatrist testify about false memory syndrome and coach testimony, trying to make the jury doubt everything we'd said. Then the prosecutor played Hollis's recordings in court. Janet's voice clear as day, talking about how to break us, how to make us grateful for scraps, how to keep us scared. The whole courtroom went silent, listening to her explain her methods to another foster parent on the phone, laughing about how easy it was to control us. Janet's lawyer asked for a recess and spent an hour trying to get the recordings thrown out, but the judge allowed them as evidence. Hollis's biological mom was in the gallery that day, and afterward she filed a civil suit against the state for failing to protect her son. She had copies of every complaint she'd filed, every report she'd made about Janet's treatment, all ignored because Janet's friend at CPS had marked them as unfounded. Other biological parents started joining her lawsuit, parents who'd lost their kids to the system only to have them placed with Janet and abused worse than they'd ever been at home. Mrs. Rodriguez got promoted to district coordinator for child welfare oversight after testifying about how many times I'd tried to report Janet at school. Her first official act was requiring all foster home visits to be recorded. No more closed-door meetings where kids could be threatened into silence. She told the news that no child should have to gather their own evidence of abuse, that the system had failed us by making us prove what adults should have seen. Mrs. Williams finally testified about the pressure she'd faced to keep placement numbers up, to avoid moving kids even when there were problems. She admitted they'd been trained to see kids' complaints as adjustment issues, to assume we were lying or exaggerating, to protect foster parents who took difficult placements. The whole system was designed to silence us, she said, breaking down on the stand as she described ignoring obvious signs of abuse because her supervisor told her to. Ms. Williams crying about ignoring red flags while kids collected evidence like tiny detectives is peak. I should have listened to the literal children telling me they were being hurt. Energy right there. Detective Walsh had been building a case against Janet's friend at CPS for months and finally had enough evidence to make an arrest. The woman had been taking kickbacks from foster parents, $500 for every favorable report, $1,000 for fast-tracking fraudulent paperwork. Janet's protection was finally gone, and more evidence started surfacing, bank records showing regular payments, emails discussing which kids to place where for maximum profit. 2 months after that first hearing, Lily and I walked into the grand jury room together, holding hands as we prepared to testify. She squeezed my fingers and said we weren't victims anymore. We were witnesses, and our words would finally matter. The grand jury listened to everything, asked careful questions, treated us like our experiences were real and important for the first time. When we walked out 3 hours later, the prosecutor was waiting with news that they'd indicted Janet on 47 counts including fraud, abuse, conspiracy, and racketeering. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my therapist's office picking at the arm of the chair while she explained that wanting Janet to love me wasn't weakness because kids are wired to seek love from caregivers, even when those caregivers hurt them. The prosecutor called that afternoon to tell me the state offered Janet a plea deal for 10 years if she'd reveal everyone in her network, but she refused and kept insisting we were all lying, and she was being persecuted for being strict. Hollis called me that night from his mom's house, and his voice sounded different when he told me he had his own room with a door that didn't lock from the outside, and we both started crying on the phone. Mrs. Rodriguez set up this conference on foster care reform, and 300 people sat there listening while I told them about the locked food and the floor eating and the Disneyland show, and when I finished, they all stood up clapping, which felt weird but good. During trial prep the next week, the prosecutor showed me this file they'd found about another foster kid Janet had 5 years ago, who died from falling downstairs, except the injuries matched abuse patterns, and now they were adding murder charges. The detective came by my apartment and told me they'd tracked down 12 more kids from Janet's past, and every single one had been sent to that same doctor who labeled them disturbed when they tried reporting abuse. I watched Lily on TV telling the interviewer she was a prisoner too, just a different kind because Janet used her to make everything look normal, and she was done being her accomplice. The judge wouldn't lower Janet's bail even though her lawyer kept arguing, and the judge said the evidence showed systematic child abuse for profit spanning almost 10 years, and she was a risk to the community. The morning of the trial, I threw up twice before getting dressed, and when we walked into the courthouse, there were reporters everywhere asking questions, but the prosecutor's team surrounded us and got us inside. Janet came into court wearing orange and no makeup, and when she saw all of us sitting together in the gallery, her face went white and her hands started shaking. The prosecutor stood up and started showing photos on the big screen of bruises and scars and playing recordings and showing bank statements while telling the jury this woman turned the foster system into her personal ATM withdrawing cash at the cost of children's lives. The judge called us to testify on day 3, and Hollis went first, his voice shaking but getting stronger as he told them about the beatings and the hunger and the nights locked in the garage. Mrs. Rodriguez went next and explained how she'd documented everything, showed them her files with dates and photos and recordings recordings she'd made when I finally trusted her enough to talk. Then it was my turn, and I walked to that stand with my legs feeling like jelly. But I told them everything about the Disneyland show and the locked food and the bruises and how Janet would practice her social worker voice in the mirror. Janet's lawyer tried to make us look like liars, but we had proof for everything, and our stories matched because they were true. Mrs. Williams took the stand the next day, and the prosecutor asked her about all those visits, and she admitted Janet knew exactly when they were coming and how to prepare. She said Janet had studied their procedures and knew what words to use and how to present herself, and she showed them emails where Janet had asked other foster parents for tips on passing inspections. The detective came up with a thick folder and started pulling out photos that made people in the gallery gasp. There was a kid named Tyler who died in Janet's care 5 years ago, and it had been ruled an accident, but the detective had found witnesses who said different. She showed reports that had been changed and medical records that didn't match, and testimony from a nurse who said Tyler had old bruises when he came in dying. The courtroom went so quiet you could hear Janet's breathing getting faster. The jury went out on Friday afternoon, and we waited 3 whole days before they came back. When they filed in, none of them would look at Janet, and I knew what that meant. The judge asked for the verdict, and the foreman stood up and said guilty on the first count, and then guilty on the second, and kept going through all 47 counts of child abuse and fraud and conspiracy. When he got to the manslaughter charge for Tyler, his voice cracked, but he said guilty on that too. Janet made this weird sound like a wounded animal, and her lawyer put his hand on her shoulder, but she shoved him away. 6 weeks later, we came back for sentencing, and the judge looked right at Janet and told her she'd betrayed the most sacred trust there was. He said she'd turned children's trauma into profit and shown no remorse, and he sentenced her to 35 years. Janet stood there in her orange jumpsuit, still trying to look innocent, but nobody was buying it anymore. 3 months after that, my foster parents took me to family court for something different. The judge asked if I wanted to be adopted, and I said yes so fast it made everyone laugh. He asked if I wanted to change my name, and I kept my first name, but took their last name, Johnson. And for the first time since my real mom died, I belonged somewhere real. The state passed something called Hollis's Law that summer, requiring video documentation of all foster visits and psychiatric evaluations for foster parents. Hollis and his mom came to the signing ceremony, and he looked so different, standing tall and smiling, and he told the reporters that no more kids would have to prove their own abuse. We started meeting up sometimes, me and Hollis and Lily, usually at this coffee shop downtown. Hollis would laugh at stupid jokes now, and Lily didn't have that guilty look anymore, and I was learning that not everyone who said they cared was lying. Lily said we were like siblings forged in hell, but siblings nonetheless, and that felt right. Mrs. Rodriguez asked me to speak at her training for new social workers, and I stood in front of 30 people and told them about the locked food and the sleeping on floors and the bruises under clothes where nobody would look. I told them to look closer and ask more questions and notice when kids flinch or when foster parents have all the right answers too quickly. Now I sit in my real bedroom with walls I'm allowed to put posters on and a door that locks from the inside, not the outside. My adoptive mom brings me hot chocolate without me asking and helps with my homework and never calls me names. I'm writing college essays about resilience and what it means to survive and rebuild. Through my window, I can see Lily pulling up in her car because she's taking me to get my learner's permit, and Hollis just texted about his mom getting a job at a nonprofit that helps foster kids. We're not just survivors anymore, we're family, the kind you choose and build and trust, creating something good from all that pain. The system failed us, but we didn't fail each other, and now we're making sure it won't fail the